Yes. Recorded, Jim, and published to the library website of both Central and South. Okay, I'm just reading a chat from the AI. And okay, I will get started. I know that we have a lot to talk about this session and people will keep filtering in. So once again, welcome to Conversations on Social Issues, COSI. I'm Katie Dichter. I use she, her pronouns. I am a faculty librarian at Seattle Central College. Probably many of you have heard this lots of times. COSI, Conversations on Social Issues. Central has been hosting COSI since 2011. That's 15 years, I'm realizing. And it kind of came out of when the Occupy movement was on our lawn at Central, and the need for us to have open dialogue about things that are important to our community in a real, authentic, sometimes uncomfortable way, so that we could all learn and grapple and do the things that libraries and librarians encourage in our work. This time, for the first time ever, it feels very groundbreaking. Central is partnering with South, the South Seattle College Library, and the most of the work for this session was done by Greta Treistman and Mei'lani Eyre. Greta works at Central and South, and sometimes North, and May is a full-time faculty librarian at South. So, and also shout out to District EDIC for contributing funds so that we can pay our speakers. Okay, the theme, I think you might know this already from emails, we are talking about American imperialism this quarter. So all the sessions in this series will focus on American imperialism and its intersections with things like disability justice, the CIA, mass surveillance, immigration, and more. So it's going to be exciting, and I know I'll learn a lot. And then we also at the end are going to think about pathways and communities of resistance. So things like land back, and how marginalized communities are taking action against imperialism. There's a culminating hybrid session, and the face-to-face session will be at South. That also has never happened in a COSI and is very exciting, as well as a mutual aid fair at South. So more on that later. And so now I hand over to the speaker for the day, who is my esteemed colleague, May. What else do I want to say about May? May is not just a fabulous librarian, but also an oral historian and community educator who centers disability justice and collective liberation. I feel really proud to work with you, May, and I'm gonna let you take the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to send a link to the presentation so that folks also just have that. But halito, my name is Mei'lani Eyre, and I am so excited to be talking to you about this today. So for this session, as Katie already said, like I'm a librarian, but I also do a lot of organizing work in community education that really highlights decolonization and re-indigenizing, because if we're going to get rid of the colonial ways of doing things, we should look at what the other ways of doing things are. So why are we going to do this series in particular? If you haven't noticed, the world is kind of in a precarious place right now. It feels like it always is, but things are different now, right? And so 2023 to 2024 brought a lot of questions about what the United States involvement is across the seas. And so this series is going to unpack what US imperialism means, past and present, and then we're also going to be connecting different alternatives. So we're going to be talking about resistance to US imperialism and land back. And in our generative session at the end of this, we're going to be looking at what it means to imagine a future that we actually want to live in. So I'm going to talk about what is imperialism. Is the US an empire? Manifest Destiny, and US Imperialism Now. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, any burning questions that you have, etc. So, what is imperialism? So when you hear the word imperialism, some of the things that might come into mind is like the Roman Empire or the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And oftentimes, like, especially in like grade school history class, we're defining empires as having emperors. But when we think about imperialism in the sense that I'm defining it, I'm referring to the system of power that utilizes military, economic, resource, and cultural influence that one nation imposes on others. So this is defining an empire by its actions and its relationships towards other nations. And it doesn't necessarily require um, an empire to identify itself or self-identify as such. And so if we think of two really large empires we've had in Western history, the British Empire, which ruled, it was the largest empire in history and covered 23% of the world's population. If you've heard the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, it was referring to the fact that it was essentially on every continent except for Antarctica. And then when we think about other empires that we've seen in the West, another one is the Spanish Empire, which was considered the first global empire. Um, and then like soon after, Portugal had followed, but what Spain was doing was really huge as it was spanning the Americas, it was spanning Africa, it was spanning Asia and Europe. And so this empire actually lasted until 1975. When some of the African colonies had gained their final independence from Spain. So we keep saying empire, we keep saying, excuse me, imperialism. Let's talk about what an empire actually looks like and what makes that. So number one, power through force, economic force and capital. It's very intertwined with money and wealth in these different ways. And the ways the empires exercise this power can be through military force. There's lots of different types of violence, but there is a big emphasis on military violence, physical violence that's enacted to expand territory, so acquire more land and protect assets, typically resources, natural resources from the land in those territories. There's also some soft power here that isn't using physical force. So it's using influence. So influencing other governments to create policies that benefit the empire. It's also using cultural influence. So that can be through things like media, it can be through sports, it can also be through language. And then another huge piece is natural resources. So when we think of what people have been sent to war for or what wars have been fought over, some folks might think of coal, oil, gold, but actually a lot of this is also agriculture. A lot of this is over things like bananas and avocados and chocolate and all of these things that in the US, some of us might take for granted. If you are from some of the countries that produce these exports, you might have a different perspective on it and experience with it. And so if we want to look at some examples of what this has been in the past, a huge one is military force. So if there's I kind of had trouble picking just one example for each thing here because there's just so much. But one example we can point to is the Trail of Tears, where Indigenous people were forced off their land and forced to migrate, like how my tribe was. And so this wasn't just I was thinking about how I was taught about this as a child in my history books, and they wrote it as like, this was bad, but you know, they signed these treaties that they would go, and so they left willingly. But you know, they signed these treaties so that they wouldn't experience complete extermination. These tribes signed these treaties so that they wouldn't be slaughtered, but even then that didn't keep the slaughter away. And as people were forced off their land, they were forced at gunpoint. Military soldiers, US soldiers entered their homes and held people at gunpoint and made them leave. So this was by no means something that was a choice from these people. Looking at cultural imperialism, another way that we can see this with Indigenous examples is the loss of Indigenous language. And seeing in different places like, here on Turtle Island, there are so many different languages that were spoken prior to colonization. And now most of them are endangered. Some of them are even extinct. And so there's all of these language revitalization programs, because your language is also indicative of how you view the world, right? If you think of some tribes, they didn't have numbers that went into like hundreds, thousands, etc., because they weren't doing trade in the same way that colonizers were. They didn't have a need to have these large quantities, but it was more important to maybe orient yourself with the land and the directions you were in, or have more robust vocabulary for your connections between yourself and your family, yourself and the land, all of our non-human relatives. So when we lose our language, we're also losing a huge part of our culture and how we can view the world in a different way. And then there's also the control of natural resources, which we see this happening in so many places already. If we think about Congo and the forced mining, which is slavery, the enslavement of Congolese people to mine cobalt and coltan for the very computers that we're using right now to have this session. We can also look at some other situations from around the world, and I think the Irish potato famine is a good example of this too, because as much as crops do fail and hunger is something that happens in the world when crops fail, famine is almost exclusively man-made. Like famine is not a thing that necessarily happens naturally without human intervention. And so when we look at something like the Irish potato famine, yes, the potato crops failed, but they weren't only eating potatoes. They had all kinds of grain, and that was considered corn under the corn laws that included things like barley and oats. And they also had penal laws that essentially created caste systems for Irish who were in occupied territory, being occupied by the English. And so there was food available, but it was being exported off of their land to England. So it's not that they didn't have things, but these policies made it possible for famine to be a reality. And so before I really dig deeper in, something I want to talk about is hard power versus soft power. So hard power is coercive power. It's something that utilizes military violence and economic violence as a means of force. So that can be a military invasion, that can be holding people at gunpoint and telling them they need to leave their home. But when it comes to economic violence, this can be sanctions, this can be tariffs. This can be embargoes, anything that's meant to force the hand of another country through these restrictive means. And then we have soft power, which is power through co-opting rather than coercion. So this is done through cultural influence and propaganda. Some ways that we see this is in music and media. The CIA actually has like an entire department that funds Hollywood, which kind of sounds wild to say out loud. But this is something that we've seen before, and you can kind of just already tell with the amount of movies that are like, oh, our soldiers are so sad after they went to some other country and committed atrocities. So there's this aspect of it. There's also the way that technology can be used in soft power. We can think of big tech as a way of that. And this also comes up with the TikTok ban, which is possibly happening. It's kind of this amorphous thing right now. But there's such a big fear from the American government because of, as the direct quote from the Congress hearings was, um, it's forwarding anti-American views. And so they want to get rid of this platform where anti-American views can be spread and pin that on China. However, I mean, you can still do this on something like Twitter. You can do it a little less on something like Facebook or Instagram, anything owned by Meta. Um, but I think something that's very funny that's happened with this is now people are using Red Note. I don't actually know how to pronounce the Chinese name for it, which is like not localized for English. And you have a lot of people joking of saying, if you want to keep me from giving my data to China through TikTok, then I'm just going to give my data to China directly through Red Note. And there's been some really interesting cultural exchanges happening because of this. And then the other piece of soft power can come through sports, right? And so if you've ever heard No Name, the rapper No Name, her song Namesake, she has a whole song about the propaganda and the way that people in the US, like different Black artists, can uphold US imperialism essentially. And so when Kendrick Lamar accepted to perform at the NFL Super Bowl, a lot of people on Twitter were quoting that because she literally says, "Go Kendrick, go," making a comment about when we, as Black people and Black artists, support these big cultural influences that propaganda is spread through and disseminated through. So with that in mind, let's talk about, is the US an empire? This is something that's like often, what's the word? Debated on, depending on who you talk to, but a lot of political scientists and historians would agree that the US constitutes as an empire, even if it doesn't name itself as such. And so one of the ways that we can see this happening early on, and just kind of as an aside, there was the obvious colonization of Turtle Island by the British and the French and the Spanish. But once America became its own nation, it expanded and there were already people here. So probably a lot of you, if you had schooling in the US, learned about manifest destiny in grade school, which was, the way it was always described to me was, it was Western expansion, but that was a really amorphous thing to like be teaching a fourth grader and then never bring up ever again. Um, And so we're going to unpack that a little bit more, because when people pinpoint when the US really started to become an empire, it's when the manifest destiny ideology took off. And so this is the ideology that Americans had a God-given right and duty to expand westward. And this was like early 1800s, really popping off in 1840s. And this was to acquire as much land as possible for the American country, for the US, um, quite literally from sea to shining sea. So these policies that supported this were really through the administrations of people like Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk. And this expansion was genocide, quite frankly, right? This was seeing Indigenous people and their sovereignty and their nations as a threat to this idea that America should be the steward of this entire piece of land. And so one of those things that came out of this was the Trail of Tears. Another piece that came out of this was the Mexican-American War, which was a war provoked by the United States because there was northern territories of Mexico that the US wanted. And so they started this war and ultimately ended up taking that land. But when researching this, a lot of sources were like, manifest destiny really ended around like 1860, but we can see a lot of ways that it didn't. particularly if like the annexation of Hawaii. So Hawaii is a um, sovereign nation. It was a sovereign nation before it became a state in the 50s. And it had been exposed to colonization from the United States in like 1820-ish, when folks were coming, um, settlers were coming to convert people to Christianity. But over time, because one of the major trade sources of Hawaii with other nations was sugar, American businessmen started owning these plantations, these sugar plantations. And they wanted to keep this going. Like sugar was a highly sought after crop at this time. This was a cash crop. And so after like decades of this and different American policies, this really created an economic reliance on the US for trade for Hawaii. In particular, there were no taxes, like it was duty free to be able to trade with the US in Hawaii. And then once the US started to expand that policy elsewhere to Cuba and some of, I believe, the Dominican Republic, this started to really change what things would look like for those white sugar traders that were settling and occupying Hawaii. And they really wanted Hawaii to then become a territory for their own business interests. So when Queen Liliuokalani had taken the throne, she wanted to create independence for Hawaii's trade. She wanted to dismantle this a bit. And those businessmen were having none of it. And so she was only in power for 1 year before the US military, backed by these traders, had overthrown her monarchy. And it was thrown with military force. And she willingly signed it over because she didn't want bloodshed. She didn't want her people to be slaughtered by the military. Another way that we can really see this is the Banana Wars, if you've ever heard of the Banana Wars. The Banana Wars is kind of like a series of wars and interventions from the US in favor of the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita, and the Standard Fruit Company, which is now Dole. Although I believe they're like intermingled in a merger as Chiquita and Dole through a different company. But this really impacted countries like Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, Panama, also Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Like anywhere where you could grow fruit. And fruit was such, like these were fruits that you could not grow easily on Turtle Island. And so in the 50s, Guatemala, their president, Jacobo Arbenz, had decided that it was time for Guatemalans to own their lands. It was time for them to own the means of their own production. And the United Fruit Company was having none of this whatsoever. Something that's also really important to note in this particular example is during this time, Eisenhower was the president, and his Secretary of Defense, one of the like higher ups in the CIA, and also his secretary, like the woman who was his personal secretary, all had some sort of economic interest in the United Fruit Company. Like his secretary was married to somebody who worked in the company. The person in the CIA also was on the board for the United Fruit Company, and his Secretary of Defense also worked for the law firm that represented this fruit company. So for this ask to come to the government, this company already had its feelers in the government to be able to make such a huge ask to overthrow the president of Guatemala through a coup in 1954. And so this was all over the fact that they might lose access to another foreign entity, sovereign nation's land that they are profiting off of. And they placed a dictator in. And after that happened, the United Fruit Company owned 42% of all of Guatemala's land. So nearly half of their land was now owned by an American entity. And this, I've read stories from people who live in Colombia who were talking about they have seen massacres happen over these bananas. They have seen people lose their lives over bananas. And the United Fruit Company has also hired like paramilitaries to be able to defend their interests. So whenever you see something that says like, oh, the US came to intervene to protect this company, it's always good to question what it was that they were protecting. And also question like, why did you need to be there in the first place? And before we go into questions, because we're going to move into discussion and questions, I also want to talk a little bit about how this impacts our present. So for one, this is about creating a sustainable future. I don't know if you've noticed, but like I had friends in Utah last year and it was 80 degrees in October. They're just like, what is happening? Like, there's so much destruction that has happened to our climate and our earth because of this resource extraction. There's so much destruction that has happened to people all over the earth and here in the United States because of imperialism. And this has also created the destabilization of entire countries. So when we're thinking about what a sustainable future looks like, it's also worth looking at what is unsustainable through these practices of imperialism, which in the case of the US is also led by white supremacy. I also want to talk about the imperial boomerang, which is a theory that is really asserting that anything the imperial core is doing overseas to colonies or to control territories, um, either particularly coercive control with hard power, that eventually is going to be used on citizens of the imperial core. And one way that we can see this happening is the way that in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter uprising, there were there was tear gas being deployed on citizens. People were being arrested just for protesting. And this was really a situation too exasperated by the fact that, at least in Seattle, this has not happened in every like police department, but a lot of our police departments in this country are sent to Israel to learn these different crowd control tactics. And so these are things that are being practiced on Palestinians actively. They are learning how to do that to people here. And as we see the cop cities that are starting to pop up, there's one being built in Lacey. This is a place where they can learn and train how to control the population when there are pieces of unrest that come up in our day to day. And so if we really want to understand like how we got here, we have to go deep into this history. And we also have to consider what things we want for a sustainable future, which is what we'll be talking about at the end of the series in March with the generative workshop on imagining futures. Um, and I also just wanted to like add to here. um, I couldn't find a good clip that was just the portion of the interview, but you might remember like 2 years, 3 years ago, John Bolton, who was like a senior official, just like straight up admitted to planning coups when asked about the insurrection, when asked if Trump was planning a coup. He's like, no, like I've planned coup d'etat before, and he's just not prepared to do it. And the interviewer from CNN was kind of stunned, was like, wait, what did you just say? Like, and he started talking about his involvement very briefly, but his involvement in planning a coup in Venezuela. Like, there are different ways that these people are not necessarily afraid to admit these things because they know that they're protected because this is the status quo of this country. That is what this imperialism creates. And so if anything, he's bragging about the things that he did. He's not going, oops, I shouldn't have said that, even though it ended up all over the news, such as this headline. So Oh wow, I finished right at 12:30. So I wanted to make sure we had so much time to really talk about these things, um, answer any questions that people have, and I have some discussion questions. But first I want to know if there's any general questions that folks have. And you can feel free to put that in the chat or unmute. And if there's no general questions, I have questions for y'all, which is, what do you want to know about American imperialism? Or kind of what are you hoping to learn more about in this series? And seeing some of the ways we can kind of extend that conversation now. Are we feeling good about our understanding of US imperialism? What is the connection between US imperialism and the War on Terror? Um, that there's a lot to unpack there. And I want to make sure that I can also like pull up some good sources for that. Because when I was working on this presentation, I was also trying to make sure that, I mean, I'm trying to put history, like decades of history into like one sentence and kind of explain it to the best of my ability. Um, but when it comes to the War on Terror, that there is an excuse, right? In 9/11 changing everything for the United States. Not just how we look at terrorism. Like I was a child when 9/11 happened, and I definitely remember the things growing up that changed in the culture, right? So when I was young, my mom always covered her hair, but we're not Muslim. And she stopped doing that because of how she was seeing people treated once 9/11 had happened. And one of the big things that has really changed from the cultural understanding to restaurants having freedom fries and there being this huge piece of patriotism was how this could be used as an excuse to surveil. Like we consolidated different departments of the government to increase funding and make sure that people had access within the government to people's data. That changed how we go to the airport. This changed all of these different pieces of the daily life. But then this also changed what we did overseas. This was not just about fighting terrorism as much as it was an excuse to use American forces, military force, to take things that we wanted, like oil overseas. If we think about the Iraq War and we think about how that really was a war for oil, and you think about all of the people that were protesting against this because they said, this is not a war that we need to be in. Um, Similarly, we can also think of Vietnam, the Vietnam War, which I've also been told by some folks from Vietnam that it's called the American War in Vietnam, because we had no business being in this war, right? But this was an opportunity to keep control over these regions, to keep control and alignment with these nations. So that is one of the ways, like I know this answer was kind of all over the place, but I also want to make sure, as a side note, we're going to be having a LibGuide that is like an expansion on all of this. So I want to make sure that I have extra sources that can really get into the deep for pretty much everything that people are asking right now. So does American imperialism extend to the Israel-Palestine conflict? Yes. Which a lot of you may have heard about the ceasefire announcement as of yesterday. Um, and this is something where if you look at the day that it takes place on the 19th, which is the last day that Biden will be in office. And so there's a lot of rightful anger from so many people because one of the major things that has happened with this genocide of Palestinians has been the US putting weapons constantly saying we want to, you have politicians saying we want a ceasefire, and then they give more weapons and they approve more aid for weapons to make sure that people in Israel, that the IDF can continue to defend itself against people that don't have nearly the same kind of military presence or support. So this is also something, if you were a student here last year, there was a cozy series on Israel and Palestine. And I believe all the recordings for that series are still up on the website. So if maybe Greta can drop the link for that, and you can also explore more of that. Will U.S. troops be on Seattle College's campuses, and how will campuses do it? I'm not quite sure I understand the second half of that question. But I can also say, I mean, I can't tell you what the future is going to be. And I can't tell you if there's anything that will happen that will lead to troops being on our campuses. But it's something that isn't out of the question, right? Even when we think of like in natural disasters, when the National Guard gets deployed. When we think of Kent University, when the National Guard was deployed on a college campus and people were killed, students were killed. And we think of the surveillance that has happened to students who were protesting at their encampments, the Palestinian Solidarity encampments just this last year. There was footage from drones, like I believe they were drones from the police department, not the military, but there were drones capturing footage of people on these encampments to surveil them, to track these people. So it's something that if the question is it a possibility? I would say yes, because we've already seen this happen on other campuses, but I can't explain, I can't tell you ahead of time, like why that would be. Um, okay, and now I'm looking at some of the other um, questions. I have one that is, I'm curious how we might understand current immigration trends from places in Latin America and US imperialism. This is a really great question, and I do think one of our speakers later on will be able to talk about this more in depth than I can at this moment. But kind of, giving you a quick overview is like, when you destabilize someone else's country, people need to go somewhere. And I think that is one of the simplest like ways I can describe. I know there's so many people that are coming here to Seattle itself as refugees. And when I hear about some of the countries that folks have come from, you start realizing there is a trend of the US intervention that caused the civil unrest or destabilization. Like it's not solely the US in some cases, but it is a larger, it's a larger piece of the puzzle. And so I think it's in February where someone from a group that works with immigration, a mutual aid group that works with immigration will be coming to speak in the Cozy series. And hopefully they can give you like a more detailed answer to that. What is the link between imperialism and fascism? This is there's so much in this question. Because there's so many things I could talk about, right? Like fascist countries ban access to information. And I'm going to look at TikTok as one of those pieces and talk more about that soft power piece of influence. And so TikTok being a tool for influence, and for people to share ideas with less censorship because it's not something that's coming from the US, which I'll also say as someone who does a lot of organizing. I see stuff, like I get different news on Twitter, which likes to think it has a lot of censorship, and in a lot of ways, um, I'll say it doesn't, not because they're not trying, but because the website is just broken. Um, there's a lot of ways that I get news that I could not find on Facebook. And if you think about why TikTok, like when we think about the TikTok ban, one of the big like stipulations was you can keep your app won't be banned if you can ensure that it gets sold to an American company like Meta. And I think it's very intentional that Meta is the one they want it sold to, because Meta has, suppressed information in the US before. And as we are coming into a big change in our government for the next 4 years, there's a lot of things they don't want people to be able to talk about. We're also like seeing this happen at a time when Trump is saying, well, let's get Canada and Greenland. Like now we're getting into this piece of like also expansion again, like land acquisition again. And I would say that one of these pieces that I especially think of as a librarian is fascism loves to suppress and censor. Um, and we also see this happening with librarians and the different legislation that is coming up in the country to tell people librarians are bad, actually. Librarians are bad for your children. Librarians will make your child trans and gay and a blue-haired leftist with pronouns. Like there's all of these different pieces that they're trying to put us in jail for in different states, or saying that it is illegal for us to give pornography, which is typically just something that mentions trans or queer people existing, or the fact that racism exists. There's all of these ways that just talking about history is being banned, and they are targeting teachers, they are targeting librarians, and they're also targeting authors. I think I like to identify when empire is the driving force of social systemic oppression, being able to articulate when, how, where it's happening would help to understand how to counter it. Yes. And I would say that this series is going to just go over that in depth in all of these different ways. That's why we're talking about CIA interventions. I believe the group that's talking about that is going to talk about Free Radio Asia and the ways that we are, like our CIA is using a news source to spread misinformation and willful like propaganda. And then there's also going to be a piece on resistance. There's also going to be a piece on land back. So I think the rest of this series will really expand more on especially those like social and systemic parts, but especially when we talk about surveillance and when we talk about mass surveillance and the role that technology plays in imperialism. I believe we have this book about, I think we have this book by Rashid Khalidi already in our library, which is really great. Let's see. Yeah. So I've answered a lot of questions that folks have already. Just kind of thinking about some of the stuff that we've talked about and like ask questions about now. I'd love to hear like just from your perspective, and it's okay if you're not sure if something falls into this or not, but like what are some examples of imperialist tactics or tools that you're seeing happening currently? The way that the United States is involved with Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. Yeah. Um, I think I mentioned this earlier when folks were talking about when I was talking about people who feel so exhaustedly angry at the fact that now there's a ceasefire when the Biden administration is exiting, when we're transitioning the government over. Um, because in so many ways, people were just used as pawns in political power. Like people's lives were taken. There was a huge human toll and cost to this power. And the United States in the past has gotten involved with Palestinian and Israeli negotiations before and been able to, like, back in the 80s, for example. I'm trying to remember if it was Carter or Reagan, but there was one of those two presidents was able to get a ceasefire within like 2 or 3 weeks. Um, and someone who was at the um, Cozy series from last year might be able to add more to this if that was covered. But like it was Reagan. Okay, yeah, it was Reagan. Um, it's the fact that like we have that kind of power in this country. Like our government has that kind of power, and has let this go on and is now using that power in coordination with other nations to get a ceasefire with like a whole phased program on like when the Rafah crossing opens again. Um, but still, it's not immediate, right? Like that was announced yesterday that a deal was officiated, and it doesn't go into effect until Sunday. So there's so much fear for so many people of like, am I going to make it to the ceasefire, or is my life going to be taken by a bomb? And that's something I think about. I've just been thinking about a lot in the last 24 hours. And I see folks adding the Blowback podcast. It's great. The Blowback podcast does a lot of really great stuff. I highly recommend it. What are some other tactics that folks can think about, or like examples that they've seen with policy, immigration policy? Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean with that? And something also with immigration policy that I'm thinking about has like recently come up with Twitter. Um, and been, I just as a side note, I just refuse to call it X. But I have seen recently with Elon Musk being like part of the MAGA crowd, making a lot of people very upset when he said he does want immigration because he wants immigrants to be able to work at his company, particularly folks from India, South Asia. and how this caused so many people to be angry because they were like, we don't want any immigrants at all. Um, and so when I think about immigration policy, it's also like who gets to be an immigrant based off of how useful they are to the companies that actually hold quite a bit of power. If we think about Elon Musk saying this, he's about to be part of our government. If that even goes through with I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but I know the office is called DOGE. It's like Department of Government Expenditure or something like that, like Dogecoin. So there's this other piece there when it comes to immigration policy that is how useful somebody can be to efficiency. Thank you. How useful somebody can be to these companies. And as we've seen through some of these examples, like going backwards, um, especially with the banana wars, but also with like the connection between like Hawaii and the banana wars is this was all about cash crops and companies that wanted to make more money off of these people and they wanted to own the land so they could make all of this money despite the fact it was never theirs to take. Okay. All right. We have about 8 minutes left. And so I also just want to know, like, what has been like your relationship with learning about imperialism, like prior to this discussion and this series kicking off? Like where were the first places you were starting to learn about this as a concept in the American context? Oh wow. We love to hear more about it from from Seattle Central College. Also, I just want to give a shout out real quick to a student named Hiba who was helping me come up with some of these discussion prompts yesterday because we were just having a really lovely conversation about this. And I love talking with students and hearing their perspectives on these things. So I'm sure your professors from your history classes are also very excited. Reading Chomsky, yeah, yeah. Manufactured consent. So that is one wild ride to learn about. Organizers in Seattle. Um, High key, a lot of things that I learned about came from TikTok. Like people that would like historians that would make little skits over things. Like that was the first time I had heard about the banana wars. And doing all of my research afterwards and being like, oh, this TikTok was pretty much like word for word the process of things that happened, realizing just how big of a tool this could be for education on so many different things. Were there were there ever times, oh, I see Sharon says, as a teen in Jamaica, noticing US involvement in the Caribbean, Grenada, Central America. Um, if you want to expand on that too and like share a little bit more, I'd love to hear about like what were some of the things that you were noticing as a teenager? And you can feel free to unmute and share that too, if you want to.
So it was mostly like noticing that America would be putting itself into other people's business and first and hearing the grown-ups around me discuss that and then hearing them speak to the fact that it wasn't like you said earlier, it's not that they're trying to help. They act like they're trying to help, but they're really trying to put themselves ahead and take over. And just coming to that realization, which you don't learn about it in school. You learn about it from being an informed, engaged citizen of where you are. And also noticing, well, recognizing the political parties and starting to see the so-called the parties for the people versus the parties for just us, and wanting to move away from what was comfortable for me and my family and community to something broader, to being, it just brought awareness of who we really are as Jamaicans and as people of the Caribbean, and how we have these treasures in terms of land and agriculture and bauxite and all of that, and how America was, you know, creating wars so that we would have civil unrest and um, civil war almost, you know, and they're doing it not they're doing it under this pretense they're helping us, but they're really just setting us up against each other so they can come in and take over. And thank God they didn't. Well, I don't know if I should say they didn't, because the current political situation in Jamaica, at least, is concerning.
And also thinking about like how this is happening in the Dominican Republic and Haiti right now. Um, just so much. There's so much there. And I also want to just thank you for sharing that too. We're almost like at time if folks have other things they want to say, but I just want to note something you said, which was they come in and pretend that they're here to help. And there were so many sources as I was trying to learn about, like as I was trying to put this presentation together, and really like cross my T's, dot my I's. There were so many sources that were like, America has always wanted to help other countries reach independence and democracy. It's like, yeah. I mean, we quite literally have a school. I think it's based out of Georgia. Once I have the name of it, I'm gonna put it in the LibGuide that will accompany each session. Um, where we train people to School of the Americas. You know what I was talking about. Yes. School of the Americas. It's where we train people to be dictators in Latin America. Like we have a school to train people to do our bidding for us. That's wild. So yes, responsible for training paramilitaries in Colombia. Yeah. Yeah. So, um, thank you all for being here. Um, and we have 2 minutes left, but I also want to like thank everybody for all of the like wisdom that you've also been sharing. Like folks have been sharing their favorite sources to learn about some things. Thank you for coming and listening and asking questions. And I'm very grateful for all of you, and I'm so excited for what the rest of this series is going to be. So
Thank you so much, May, and everyone for coming. The next COSI is in exactly 1 week, January 23rd, and look for an invitation from library.central on your calendar and an email reminder as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Greta has posted a link to the guide several times in the chat, so that's where we kind of collect all the ideas that have come up and put them in a place where you can look at them again, and the recording will be there as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm gonna click the red button and eat my soup.